So I'm downstairs in the office at the moment, and in the corner I have a little repository of things, bits of memorabilia and it's props that I've used in other videos, and also some books. And people have looked at the books on previous videos and commented and said, I was zooming in to have a look and see what you've got in the shelf. And I thought, well, wouldn't it be a good idea to actually just talk you through some of the books that I've got, some of the books that have influenced me, and the sort of books that I'm interested in reading, because hopefully they should be of interest to you too. So yeah, let's have a look at my sort of recommended reading list in this video. I've been successfully betting and trading for over 20 years. So if you want more videos like this one, then please subscribe, like, and click on the bell icon to get notification of new videos as they're released. You should also visit the Academy, where we offer more structured learning. You can visit the forum, where you can speak to like-minded people and download additional content. And don't forget to go to our website and download a free trial of betangel, the cutting-edge software that will completely transform your trading. So the first thing to point out is that most of these books are slightly older, because typically I will read on Kindle now, or I do like, if I'm out on my mountain bike, to actually use Audible, and that means that I can exercise and take in information at exactly the same time. And I find that's quite beneficial because, you know, when you're really pushing hard, you're sort of focused on what the person's saying on the book itself, and you're not thinking too much about the amount of incredible pain that you're suffering, and that just seems to carry me along quite well. So in the summer I tend to be listening when I'm out on my mountain bike, and in the winter I'll tend to be out walking or doing some form of exercise, and I'll listen to Audible there. Or if I'm just sat down casually, Kindle is quite a nice way to read information. But I still do have a few books, and if I particularly like something, I will buy the hardback. But probably where we should start is have a look at some of the books on the shelf here, because these sort of historic. They represent a little bit of history, but I can talk you through some of the things that you can see in the background here. So if we look specifically on the shelf behind me, I will talk about books I'm reading at the moment, but these are books that I've read in the past that I've just sort of kept rather than throw away, and I have them on there because they're just fun to look at now and again. And when I read some of these books, they remind me of things that I've learned, and they're good lessons to keep relearning all of the time. Probably the most influential book that I've read, and this isn't related to betting but to investing, was The Making of an American Capitalist by Roger Lowenstein. This completely changed my perspective on what I should be doing on the investing side of things. And I think that this book is much better than The Snowball. You can see the snowball in the distance here. This was written from an autobiographical, emotive perspective. This is about what Buffett did and how he did it. So this totally transformed my life, because having read this book when I was in the air coming back from the US, I immediately bought some Berkshire Hathaway stock when I landed. And the rest, as they say, is history. It's probably the cheapest book I've ever bought because it's earned me so much money. But necessarily because I've got this book, I've also got security analysis, and I've read loads of Michael Porter stuff. This is all related to investing in one form or another. But I think if you want to learn about Buffett properly, this is probably the book that is the best written book on him. A lot of other stuff that's followed is quite fluffy, really. Going from left to right here, if you don't know anything about probability, Taking Chances was quite a good book. I can't remember when this came out, it was a long time ago, but I thought it encapsulated a lot of games of chance pretty well. So probably worth a read. You may even be able to get it at a very heavy discount now, I should imagine. I remember buying this in Oxford when I went to listen to a lecture, and I just picked it up and I thought, yeah, that's quite a nice book. Puzzles Finance, very esoteric, financial, market related, probably not recommended to anybody that isn't good at maths. Then we've also got here, this is where you see the horse racing influence start to come into the mix. Monty Roberts, the man who listens to horses. If you watch horse racing, you will see a Monty Roberts rug every day in most flat races. So this was giving me some information in terms of how horses behaved and why they behaved that way. Predictably Irrational. This was a book that I bought by Dan Ariely, or Ariely. I'm not quite sure how to pronounce his surname. Sorry, Dan. But it's recommended because it's a nice introduction to behavioural science and the way that people do things that perhaps they really shouldn't. And Benoit Mandelbrot, he came up with fractal theory and science around fractals. Probably not particularly useful in a lot of aspects of stuff that I do now, but it was interesting nonetheless. There are some books like Why Flip a Coin that talk about games of chance, and obviously that's a theme on a lot of my book shelves and all of the books that I buy. But you've also got things like The Hidden Mathematics of Football, which you won't see on most listed in most places because it's so niche. As are things like the number games, although I think this sold particularly well. But these are all related to football, as is Why England Lose, and other facts, blah, blah, blah. But you can also see on here myths and facts about football. I'm not sure if I've got the right camera there, quite camera angle. But you can see that there's a theme developing in terms of some of these books. I'm quite interested in some of the detail because that's where you'll find an edge in a lot of these games. And in different sports, it's worth understanding them in great depth because then you may be able to find a decent strategy off the back of that. But also I've got some classics here like Fooled by Randomness. If you've never read Fooled by Randomness, I can tell you and summarise the whole book for you in one sentence. Outsiders score more often than you would think. But I've also got things like Against the Gods, which is all about risk. That was a really interesting read. I remember that one particularly well. And then over here, I've also got a couple of other things as well that are more specifically horse racing oriented. I was interested in learning how to handicap a horse race. So More Than On Time and Winning More by Don Scott were two books that I read very early on. And a curious one in the corner here, Provincial Banknotes. This is actually to do with my hobby. I literally collect money for a hobby, and I collect money during the day as my day job. So yeah, my hobby is very similar to what I do during the day. But that's what you can see in the bookshelf, but it's only a brief overview of a few books that I have actually read in the past. It's probably worth me talking more specifically about books that I'd recommend that you read now. So on one of the shelves I do have my old ZX81, and I have the ZX80 reference guide, thrilling stuff, but also the Rothman's yearbook that I used to do data entry when I had a ZX81. That's one of the curiosities that we have on the shelves here. So what about books that you don't see on my shelf? Well, let's start with a biggie, Mark Douglas, Trading in the Zone. Never read it, and I have absolutely no intention of ever reading it. And part of the reason for that is that in my early part of my career, I didn't know about the book, and yet I managed to piece together all the pieces of the puzzle without it. So I don't really want to read the book now because I sort of feel comfortable with where I'm at, and I don't feel that I need to read it. And I've also been very successful without it. When you look at the sort of books that I read, I'm more interested in instructional books or dialogues of what people did and how they did it. Because those are the things that are of real interest to me. I want the building blocks to be able to put into place for me to, see how that fits into exactly what I'm trying to achieve. I don't want to be told what to do, and I don't want to be sold to. So one of the things I'm really keen to avoid are books that are made to sell. You can spot them by a mile off because typically they have a sort of clickbaity type cover, which is, so-and-so's financial freedom or for a living or whatever. These, not all of them, but quite a few of them are made to sell, and you can see how the publisher said, oh yeah, that's great, but it's not going to sell. So some of the books that you see that I buy and read are books that the publisher has probably gone, oh no, we're only going to do 500 copies of that, but actually those are some of the most valuable ones that you can get. But if we look on my Kindle, and I'll read off some of the more notable ones to you that I have found very interesting, that I think you may find very interesting, and I'll end you on the biggest one of the lot. So let's have a look at some of the books that I've read or that I'm listening to that I think will be of interest to you. So let's have a browse of some of these, and we can have a look, and I can give you a quick one-liner in terms of what I find interesting in these books, and books that I would sort of recommend that you should have a read of as well. I recently read Punters, which was all about Paddy Power. I didn't discover anything new in there. I thought it was worth a read. It hardly mentioned Betfair at all. No surprise there. But it tells you the story of Paddy Power from where they were, where they started, up to fairly recently. That was quite an interesting read. It's sort of what I'd call a casual read. The Biggest Bluff was an entertaining read as well, by Maria Kornikova. She learns to play poker and compete at a WSOP tournament. That was entertaining, but again contained very little information. Flash Boys will give you some insight into high frequency trading on Wall Street. That's an entertaining book. But the book that I found much more interesting was Flash Crash, which was all about the guy in Hounslow that accidentally crashed the Dow Jones Index and lots of other stocks. That I thought was an absolutely fascinating read. If you are interested in understanding a sport particularly well, it's worth reading up on it. You've seen some of the football books that I've got up here. The Inner Game of Tennis. Buy it, read it. It's really interesting. One of the most entertaining books that I've read that will give you insight into human behavior that I bought recently, and this is a top read if you're interested in it, and it was particularly entertaining on Audible, was Alchemy by Rory Sutherland. He works in advertising, and he's taken behavioral science and then applied it to that particular marketplace. And the interesting thing is that he can give you real live world examples and in a very entertaining manner. So I would put that top of your list in terms of if you want to understand the way that people think. Nate Silver, The Signal and the Noise, that's a top recommendation as well, because Nate does a range of predictions. I'm not going to explain in great depth who he is because we don't have the time, but that is definitely a recommended read. One of the first books that I ever read was Popular Delusions and the Madness of Crowds, which I think you could probably get online for free, but it talks a bit apocryphally about popular delusions and where markets have completely lost their senses, and it will give you a good insight as to which markets have lost their senses now and why. So that's definitely worth reading, and you can probably get it for free now. One of the most influential books that I've read recently was Super Forecasting. I found that super interesting, excuse the pun, but that was a book that I would rank up there as something that you should definitely read. Now, a really interesting book that I read not so long ago was Algorithms to Live By. It's the dullest title ever. I'd be surprised if it ever sold that many, and the publishers were probably doing their nuts on that particular title, because who on earth is going to buy a book called Algorithms to Live By? But it's actually brilliant. It encapsulates, there are certain problems that are intractable, that you can come up with algorithms to solve, or that you can basically use in your everyday life. So like, which toilet should you use at a festival? How many houses should you view before you decide that you found the right one? And things like that. How deep into town do you go? And how many parking spaces do you pass before you decide that you should pull over and use one of those parking spaces? Really interesting stuff like that. I thought it was a really good book. So probably the most interesting book that I've read in recent years. I went in a roundabout way to discover it and find it, but it was Thinking Fast and Slow by Danny Kindman. When I discovered that, suddenly the penny dropped on everything that I'd been doing. I'd been reading loads of little books, and like I'd been reading Predictably Irrational, and suddenly I realized that Thinking Fast and Slow was the source of information for all of these things. Daniel Kindman is a Nobel Prize winner, and curiously, his field of work is in psychology, but he won the Nobel Prize for economics because it was all about decisions to do with money. So I realized that when I discovered Thinking Fast and Slow, that was the book. That was the most important book for me. And then it started to make sense how all of these other books had been created, because they're all subsets basically of his work. And that also led me to go off and watch as many lectures as I could that he had given, all of the work that he'd done, the original paper that he did, which won the Nobel Prize, which was about prospect theory. And that was the book that's been most transformative in all of the years that I've been reading. Because there were lots of things that I couldn't understand within the market and that didn't seem to make any sense. And it was only when I opened that book did they all begin to make sense. And it changed the way that I traded, because what I did was I started looking at examples in his book and then trying to find them within the market. And as soon as I did that, I found them absolutely everywhere. So it was a real revelation. It's a big book. It's very hefty. It's quite a heavy read. But I'd say that if you're only going to buy or read one book out of that entire list, make it that one, because it's the most transformative book that I have recently read. So yeah, there's quite a few suggestions on there. I could go on and on really, but those are some of the interesting books that I've seen over a number of years, and ones that I've been reading recently that perhaps you should have some interest in as well. The list is absolutely exhaustive. I don't know how many I've got on here. I've probably got 200 to 300 books of one sort or another. And during my downtime, that's what I tend to do. I listen or read on some of those books, because you just need one little bit of nugget of information and it could completely transform exactly what you're doing. So anyhow, yeah, there's a bit of information in there. You get to see some of the stuff that's on my shelf, but more importantly, some of the books that I'm reading. I found them helpful, and I'm sure you'll find them helpful too.